we're just going to dive right in today. There is no docket. We promised an AMA, and that's what we're going to do. So I want to take a moment to welcome Dave and Brian, who anyone who's familiar with Red Canary live and/or virtual events should be familiar with Brian. So thank you all very much. I appreciate it. We're going to dive right in. We did pull a couple of questions like from the mailbag, so stuff that you all have kind of dropped in previous episodes and things like that. So while we sort out the questions that are coming inbound right now, I want to start by asking a question of Dave and Brian. So this came in from Colin, and we've been wanting to get to it because I think it's a fascinating question, and I guess particularly for this audience, seems like a great way to understand, like, not just like what we're doing day by day at work, but like what we're really interested in experimenting with and what we feel some kind of urgency to learn. So the question is, like, what new things are going on in your home labs right now? It came in from Colin. So Dave, I'm going to start with you since you kind of walked into this trap already. So
yes.
so take us through your old man yells at cloud moment, and let us know, like, what you've been working on in your spare time.
Yeah. So I found myself at a dinner party where I was that obnoxious guest that knew more than everybody else. I was talking with a young guy who just won a Y Combinator event for some work in the quantum computing field, and I was super interested in hearing about what he did. And like within the first couple of minutes, it came up that he was coding using Cursor. And I said, "Oh my God, he's a vibe coder," and of course that killed the vibe of the whole conversation. And I realized after that conversation, like, I hated it when old farts did that to me when I was new. And so um, I'm sure my wife was really pleased with me. But on Mother's Day, I downloaded Cursor and burned through all of my free credits. And I asked myself, like, how do I go about actually determining for myself whether I think this vibe coding thing is actually working or not? So I went back to the advent of code, and if none of you have done that, it's a fantastic exercise for practicing and honing your programming chops. Lots of interesting algorithmic work to do there. But there's always a set of problems that I have neither the heart nor the gumption to do because they're just a pain in the butt and they're a slog to implement. And so I went back to the things that I hadn't finished, and I said, "Hey, let's see if I can get Cursor to solve these for me." And I will tell you that there are parts of Cursor that were absolutely magical, right? I could take a prompt, and the prompt would say that there are like 3 or 4 different example data sets in there with possible or with expected output values where you'll get that value if your algorithm is right. And I could just drop the prompt in and say, pull this out into a data file with the data set, the expected value, and update my input parsing function to parse that correctly and turn me a list of test sets that I can then iterate over. And it just worked. And I will tell you, I've used this framework in my advent of code for the last, well, since probably 2016. And I have never actually coded that particular set of code because it's boring as hell to do. And it just did it. All right. So I got super, super excited. And then if anyone wants to try this home, I would love to compare notes, but I went to day 12 of the 2024 Advent of Code, part B. And I will tell you, I burned a lot of credits trying to get that algorithm to work. And it never quite figured it out. And by the way, I hadn't figured it out either because I didn't want to bang my head against this algorithm. And what I concluded from this is that, like, there is a huge opportunity for removing toil that's thoroughly legitimate. And like, I love the experience of interacting with code in natural language. I'm kind of sold on this idea, but I'm also convinced that you need to have skills, probably skills I don't yet have, to really make this sing. It's not a panacea that's going to remove the human from the loop. And I think it's going to drive a requirement for us that build software to get really good at specifying the problem. And like, I know that in my own code, I have gone cheap on test cases because it's just added work, it's added typing. And I think this might be a way to re-level things so that you can actually lean in first on your test first program and building tests around this. And that automated testing, like if that's not part of your normal flow, then you're eventually not going to be able to scale what it is that you're building. So I'm a convert. I have not had enough time with it yet, but it was super cool, and I am repentant. I'm going to go back to Adam. If you're listening to this, sorry for being a jackass at dinner, but I'm going to go back to him and tell him, hey, you were right. I was wrong. I'm an old man yelling at clouds. You're not an idiot. I didn't say he was an idiot. I didn't think he was, but I kind of projected if you can't code it by hand, then you don't know what you're doing. And that wasn't right.
I love it. Had I haven't had full on experience with the like kind of vibe coding phenomenon, but I will say like as someone who has like built 1,000 little tools in my time and it like really appreciates the utility of like building a tool and just kind of automating small tasks. I've used some of these things extensively for that, Copilot and other stuff. And it has been like, it's wild how much like as a non-professional software developer, how much time that has saved me. It's very, very cool. Brian, how about you, man? What are you like? What are you into? What's your current area of interest?
So we have been playing around with these ideas of doing like atomic red team, like I don't know if you'd call them classes, but like trainings, talks and things. So I've basically just been trying to look through like whenever we go to conferences, we get a ton of questions about like, how do I do this in Atomic Red Team? How do I do that? And like the answers to these questions are pretty simple. And we should have a library of just like videos where we explain how to do this. So like in terms of what's going on in Brian's home lab right now, the answer is nothing, but the aspiration is to build out an ability to go and like say, all right, we have these cool features in Atomic Red Team. We have never really created any meaningful content to explain how they work, and to just kind of line those things up and start, knocking them down as quickly as possible. Particularly with things like Atomic Runner that are like the evolution of Invoke Atomic would allow enterprises to really, really easily do continuous detection gap analysis across their environment and like sort of answer really simple questions about, can we cover this? Can we detect that? Um, so time permitting, which who knows when that'll happen, I'd love to dig into that stuff.
I love that. Yeah, I was actually glad you mentioned the like the emulation aspect of it because I think that's like that in particular feels like that's right in the sweet spot of like have to build some software, can be a little bit gnarly, but like particularly like the atomic kind of data structure really lends itself well to like handing something like that off. So that's awesome. I appreciate it. Well, thank you all. We've got a bunch of questions coming in, so we're going to get right to the stuff. I'm going to try to manage a mix of kind of chat and the things that have come in via Zoom. So um, I'm going to pick on one of these, and Brian, I'm going to throw this at you first. So like there's a question here, which is just like, what are some of the most recent attacks that we've observed here at Red Canary? And like, I know we'll kind of, so it came in from Jamari. Thank you for the question. We try to do a good job of covering like some of the recent attack trends that we see here in this office hours format in particular. But Brian, I'll give you an opportunity, just like free from the structure of all of our like reporting and our data platforms. Like, what's been kind of like very recent from your standpoint, and what have you found interesting?
I mean, just like minutes before I jumped on this, I was seeing some suggestions that this kind of semi-advanced loader Bumblebee that we read about a bit back like in 2024, but haven't seen a lot out of, um, appears to be making something of a comeback using like generation algorithms to sort of spin out different domains to deliver stuff from. Someone is screen sharing their screen right now. Whoever was doing that, don't. Um, I'm curious to dig into that. I did not have time to do it because I literally jumped from one call onto this. But as usual, like it's just a steady trickle of kind of stealers and loaders that we're always seeing across these environments. And I'll be interested to see if we end up talking about that in the upcoming intelligence insights.
Let me ask you a follow-up question with the Steelers, is because there was a question in here specific to like I guess the um like like browser security in general. So and I'm actually failing to find the question in the sheet right now. But yeah, so it's like there was a question, here it is. So it came in from Michael. So like, what should a SecOps team do if the company isn't interested in an enterprise browser solution? but do have to protect the browser attack surface. And I'm asking you that as a follow-on, specifically because like I think there's been a wildly recurring theme, particularly here in office hours, but also in our research. Stealers like Bumblebee and others, wildly prevalent. And in particular, we've been focusing a lot on like what they're going after, which is increasingly like session tokens, browser data, things like that. So, I don't know. So like, what would your immediate take be on, for someone who's not going to go buy Island and replace Chrome with it? Like, what would be like your 1-2 punch of things you do? And then Dave, I'll get your thoughts after this too.
Yeah, I'll actually defer to Dave because I think that we've done some stuff internally recently that he'll have some insight into that I don't necessarily have as much insight into. But I like browser-based threats are an enormous problem, right? Like whether it's threats that are just coming in through the browser via like malvertising, SEO poisoning, and stuff like that, and also ones that are just straight up targeting information stored in browsers, like cookies and things they can use to log in to legit services. But like to me, the problem is even more compounded based on recent decisions like from Chrome to defang things like uBlock origin, right? Like I used to be able with a click of a button to just turn off JavaScript in my browser, and like that functionality is gone. If I want to do it now, I have to do it universally and just break my entire browser until I'm done having it turned off. Um, like so yeah, I don't know, Dave. What do you think? If like what options are available to you other than like weird GPO stuff that you can do in weird management settings and like Google Workspaces? What options are available to security teams if they're not going to invest in sort of like a browser security tool?
The way I think about it is if you're not going to invest in a browser security tool, then you have to fall back to the next level where you do have visibility and the ability to respond, which means back to your EDR. It's not great. You're gonna need to invest more in an identity detection and response tool because you're right. The things that you can steal from a browser tend to be session based, which tend to I would hope trigger some form of identity uh, telemetry. But I think it's a dangerous move to not have some kind of observability in the HTTP flow. And I would ask, I guess, if your organization isn't open to an enterprise browser, I would ask if that's like, hey, we're not interested in Island because of the friction uh, in changing people's default browser. Like there are emotional challenges in that sale. We actually went with something called Layer X, which is a plugin, which is pretty non-intrusive and follows a very similar pattern to Island. And honestly, it's just not that expensive. And I think that it's going to get harder and harder to justify given how much work is done, given how ubiquitous the browser is as a client for interaction to pretty much every critical system. It's going to get harder and harder to justify not having some kind of protection in the browser.
I do 99.9 repeating percent of my work in a browser.
Yeah,
Like
so we had Netscope in place because we
so
felt it was
pairs really
important.
nicely with the next question, by the way.
Yeah. So we had that in place because we felt like, hey, we also need to cover the non-HTTP paths. But the days of SSHing into stuff seem to be pretty well gone. There are other ways that you can grant access into these cloud services that aren't SSH based. And so we figured out we didn't really have that much need for that use case, and you could fall back to protections within the browser, which are way less disruptive in our experience to the user experience than if you're sitting right in the middle of TCP stack, because that always ends up complicating your support processes.
Yeah, and like one thing I'm going to add to that, just a like really simple bit of advice is like, this is really specific to browsers, and I think cross-platform it can be done more elegantly with enterprise browsers or enterprise browser management. But I'd say like attack surface reduction principles there go a long way, which is just making sure that you're allow listing things like extensions, not allowing extensions in willy-nilly, locking to extension versions and entitlements. So yeah, awesome discussion there, and I appreciate the insights. All right, we got a bunch of questions, so we're going to move on. Uh, going to give you guys about 60 seconds each, and then you're getting the hook. So, and this next one, I'm going to take a pass at this first. So like Lance asked a question, which is how Red Canary is going to tackle, data security in general. So things like, I guess, like, Microsoft Purview, DLP, like that entire space. I'm gonna take this one first, mainly because this is, as long as Red Canary has existed, this has been a thing a lot of customers have asked for, like DLP. I'd say like old school DLP, like installed it on your computer DLP was like really prevalent in the early days of Red Canary and has shifted. But the this is a tough one. I think there's like a fundamental principle here that like business context can get to be like really hard to come by when it comes to like investing like DLP related threats. The coming to you live from atop Red Canary World Headquarters is not working out for me right now. It got quite windy. Can you all hear me okay?
Not really.
Rats. So
Yep.
we're gonna pivot. So I'll say like that, and
Uh-oh.
Oh, I think we lost him.
or how much I think the
There we go. He's back.
single biggest issue has been like when it comes to DLP in particular, like did Dave take that thing out of, did he take the data out of Salesforce because it's Dave's job, or did Dave to take the data out of Salesforce to take it somewhere else? And like that's a really tough business context problem to solve from an investigative standpoint. So I think that's been one of the main reasons that I think we've shied away from trying to like do that work for our customers. And I think there's, from a product standpoint, I do think like there's a separate kind of question and interesting thought experiment here, which is like, do some of the underlying problems related to like DLP, meaning like data classification, pattern matching, like user behavior, things like that. Do those get better just by virtue of the fact that so much more of this is like in SaaS and not on endpoints, right? And so I think there were some kind of like prerequisites to DLP for a long time that I just don't think anyone could do well, and therefore the entire kind of like DLP investigative flow was broken. But I don't know, like if you all have a couple of quick thoughts there, would love to hear it. Dave, maybe, I know like this is near and dear to kind of your day job, right? So
So Rob Reck, the founder of Colorado Equal Security, put together a CISO dinner around this topic several months back, and the consensus around the table was we're all sad. Like the promise of DLP has never actually materialized because it is such a hard problem. There's so much context required. I don't think anybody's really cracked it. And I do think, from our perspective, no, I'm not going to say that because I think a lot of DLP use cases are actually detecting when something bad is happening as opposed to preparing for it. But like before you can really detect something bad happening, you've got to have telemetry from which to make that decision, and data classification and business context around why somebody has access. It makes that difficult. One of the interesting things I'm seeing that isn't really DLP related, but that might apply to this problem, is I was talking with, and I'm going to completely space on the name. Oh, the Signal, SGNL, I think is the name of the company, not Signal, the messaging company. But they are a conditional access provider for a lot of SaaS systems, sort of a universal conditional access. And one of their use cases is we're going to tie granting access to stuff to outside things like a customer ticket. So that you have to prove that when you're accessing something, you have actually a business reason to be doing it. And I think in forcing that proving of context, it makes it harder to get into a position to start pulling data down. Because suddenly then when someone like is going in to steal data, if they don't have a reason to be looking at it right then, that's going to make it easier to detect. But I still think that there are going to be more ways around that than there are ways to block it.
yeah, that is like I think that's the hamster wheel we try to avoid getting on. It's a tough problem, particularly from a service provider standpoint. Awesome. All right, so I'm going to move on. We got a question that came in from LinkedIn, and I this came in from David. And so pretty open-ended, but it said kind of question was thoughts on the current cybersecurity job market. And like, do you think there's a lack of skills with the new generation of security professionals? I love this question and this topic. Dave, I think we've talked about this. We've just been like out for a walk or having lunch. But Brian, I'm going to start with you. So yeah, I don't know, like what's your overall take on, either the state of the market and or kind of like the, skills alignment?
So generally speaking, I think the entire job market is weird right now. So like take that as a caveat, I suppose. I also think that there's always an issue with skills for people coming into the industry. Like like formalized security training is very new. Like when I joined this industry in 2010, it didn't really exist. Like people got into security because they like came out of like old school hacker boards in the 90s and they were self-taught, and like sort of higher education and places like SANS have tried to formalize that a little bit and they've gotten better at it. But like I think that it's going to get worse, and I think that a big problem like is going to be coming from AI. And I think that a lot of what AI is very good at is going to erode at the things that people typically do early in their career in InfoSec. And I'm very, very concerned about that because it is really hard to jump from like tier one SOC person to doing more advanced hunting and response type stuff.
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth, which it definitely feels like it's going to have an outsized impact on folks who are new to the field for sure. Dave, I saw you nodding your head. I'm going to give you 30 seconds. What you got?
Yeah, I want to second that. I think that a lot of the AI stuff is going to make the barrier to entry for junior folks harder, and it's going to make it harder for junior people to get the mileage they need to become senior people. I also feel like the AI in the hiring market right now makes it so that if you don't know anybody, you're not getting a job. And I think we need to rethink how we function as a community so that people coming in have the opportunity to know folks in the industry and to showcase their skills so that someone can give them a leg up. Because once you get your foot in, it's a different deal. But getting that first job is hell.
Yeah, getting over that initial hurdle. I'm gonna there's Robert just shot in a question that's directly related, and so I want to take that, and then I want to kind of move on to there's a couple interesting SaaS questions in here. So like Robert's question was a follow on, which is like adding to that security education topic. What do you recommend for people who want to get started in the field? And I'll say like I have written this down probably 9 times and failed to actually put it on the internet, but like my head is stuck in this place where I continue to believe, and I think specific to that last question too, like are the skills staying relevant and current? I do, and I want to believe that despite AI and everything else, there are going to be like a few kind of fundamental skills that will never age out. And that is like understanding how computers work, first and foremost, microprocessor architecture, how memory works. Once you kind of get past a lot of like the initial access and a lot of the attack surface aspects of security, most really bad things like still depend on those primitives. Like they still need to put malware on a computer most of the time. Understanding how computers talk and interact, right? It's like understanding networking. In a world where to a lot of folks now, like networking is like done through Terraform, or you're clicking buttons in AWS, or you're dragging and dropping networks together. Like adversaries still need to get into systems and they still need to get things out, and understanding that is still wildly important. And then I think just understanding the principle, like how software is written, how code is broken, and there's a few good books on those topics. So I think I appreciate that question, and hopefully that was a useful follow-up. So I'm going to pivot a little bit here because we have a pretty specific question. This is a really interesting one. So, and there's a lot to it, so I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but the question was related to like protecting SaaS. I'd call it like endpoints or APIs. So like if you're using a SaaS product and that SaaS product has APIs that presumably, the SaaS software is using under the hood, but you're probably also using to integrate. How are people protecting that? And there was kind of a couple, question about like API filtering or firewall service, things like that. Dave, I'm gonna kick this one over to you, since I know like a huge part of your job is like, you and your team just trying to understand and protect like the massive like SaaS application stack that like is just day-to-day work here at Red Canary. So yeah, what do you think like in terms of like tools, approaches, like is it practical to do things like say, you know, only only people in this like geography can interact with the APIs for this service? Like how's that work big picture?
Yeah, so that's a tack that a lot of the vendors that I spoke with at RSA are taking. And I've seen vendors fall into two categories. One is the one that is sort of a an identity centric solution. The others are the API centric solution. If you're looking specifically for API firewall type things, you might look at a company called Firetail.io. Um, a buddy of mine that came out of Rapid7 has built that, and it's super clever dude. But like there are limitations to how effective things like network controls can be, right? Um, when we're humans, like we come from pretty standard locations, right? But if you're going to be connecting, SaaS product A to SaaS product B, we have had cases where SaaS vendor B that wants to connect into our AWS says, no problem, our egress IPs are the entire Azure address space. Like that is not really limiting much of the internet, right? Because an adversary spins up something in Azure and suddenly they've bypassed that control completely. So I haven't seen a magic bullet around this yet. I think that there's going to be more work in API security around identifying probably behavioral um, characteristics of stuff coming in. But I think it's still a very early days in that.
Yeah, that's the API firewall one in particular. There was I actually just caught that there was a separate question from Charlotte that I think was overlapping and maybe specific to like, you know, that kind of that tack you mentioned people taking, which is just um, firewalling by geography. You know, the entire Azure address space is not a super a super useful scope, but it's still better than saying, you know, anything in the world. So Charlotte asked a question about, you know, Microsoft sending DNS requests, especially for Teams to Chinese infrastructure, which is like not specifically like API protection, but I think does fall very much in that similar vein of like the complexity and kind of like the breadth of places you need to kind of look and understand and blockade in some cases to protect SaaS apps in general. Like I think about, you know, when I try to go to a domain, not necessarily based on geography, but just something that's newly registered. Like I really appreciate that I get a little warning from Red Canary that says, hey, like this domain was registered 12 hours ago. Are you sure this is where you want to be? And just being able, to your point earlier, Dave, about like being able to be in line with the right types of communication and in particular like browser request response, um, wildly important. And then I think on the infrastructure side, I think that's where that same principle applies to like the APIs that underlie these SaaS applications.
Specifically on the Teams thing, Zoom was doing this rather famously like 4 or 5 years ago, I remember, and we had to like disable certain parts of Zoom to prevent it from like sort of going in and out of China. So I don't think it's terribly abnormal, but I don't also have anything enlightening beyond that to say.
Hey, I realize we are at time now, and like we have got, I think we got through like most questions. We've got a few left here. I will say, like maybe as we close, we'll do a couple minutes of overtime. So I think there were 2 or 3 different questions that came in specific to like the actual books that we would recommend people read. So I'm going to do a lightning round here real fast. Like Brian, if you had to recommend only 2 books and you don't get much time to
Oh,
explain
good
why,
Lord.
what would you recommend that folks read if they're getting started in the field?
Um, so like generically learn like you sent me a book about Python a few years ago, and I'm not a good coder, and I read this whole book about Python, and it was tremendously useful in just like learning front to back how what was definitely then the most common coding language works, and like getting a real thorough understanding of like the concepts that underlie like how all of the software that we're using is actually built and used. And then the other one, selfishly, is kind of like my favorite threat intelligence book, which is Sandworm by Andy Green
Bird.
Greenberg. Yeah, so that's basically about the Russian like state-sponsored intel groups hacking into like manufacturing firms around the world back in like 2016 time period. Really, really fascinating book. Tells the whole story of the NotPetya attacks, where those like high level, allegedly NSA exploits got leaked. Then they got used in this vast ransomware attack that shut down a bunch of very, very big shipping companies and basically brought like the entire shipping industry to a halt like overnight. Fascinating book.
That was awesome. And I just like in that same vein, hopefully this was not going to be one of yours, Dave, but I saw Cuckoo's Egg mentioned by Kenneth there, which is like, I think like the canonical book for folks who want to understand what it's like to just kind of like see a weird thing, pull a thread and end up in like a pretty well entangled incident response engagement, whether that's what you intended to be or not. So, all right, Dave, go ahead.
Sorry, so you caught me. I don't actually know how to read. So I'm gonna give you sort of two different things. One's not a book. The thing that influenced my thinking about risk the most was I read a whole bunch on the prep material to take the OSCP. Anything that you can find write-ups of any of the difficult box, better yet, do that course. Even though it'll make you a legitimately dangerous hacker as of 2000, it still covers like all of those core foundational ideas that really influence how you think about how risky something is. So that was super profound in influencing my thinking. The other one was How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk, which helped to bridge the gap between how I think about security and how the business thinks about security.
I love that book. That was awesome, and I think for the same reasons that you just described, Dave, that was like a great, concise kind of explanation of like how I found it incredibly useful. I'll give you my couple real quick. TCP/IP Illustrated, Volume 1 explains most of what underlies like everything that we do all day. Like that is how the internet works book, and I think was my desk reference for most of 2 decades. Exploiting Software, How to Break Code was probably the first book that really opened my eyes to like how software a lot of it does a pretty good job of helping to explain a lot of the primitives that like underlie, like there's some computer architecture stuff, there's some like explaining of how software is typically made, but most importantly like where that goes wrong and how adversaries take advantage of it. So like those two in general, and there's so many good ones over here in the chat. I think we are 100% just going to turn this into a blog post. So we're into 5 minutes of overtime. I appreciate everything so much, Brian. Dave, thank you guys for being with us. Thank everyone for the questions. I think we've got a handful we didn't get to. I apologize for that, but we are going to try to consolidate some of these and make sure we answer them here in future episodes. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Appreciate you joining us. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye.